3, 4.
Hello, and welcome back to Philosopherry. Today we are going to have a discussion about evil. Now, this one might be hard to have a bit of crack around, but we'll do our best. Before this discussion, I asked people a question, a simple but a kind of a heavy question, and that is, what is evil? And here's what they said. Evil is subjective and highly dependent on context. Evil is the absence of love. Evil is things that make you recoil in fear. Evil is malicious intent to defy human nature and cause egregious, unnecessary suffering. Evil is the disregard for consequences sacrificed to desire or impulse. It's the gratuitous corruption of nature. Evil is Netanyahu starving children. It's Sharia Muslims. It's paedophile priests. Or it's the Irish government. Evil is a matter of there being an absence of caring or empathy, but by an intentional agent that could try to care, but doesn't. Evil is the active pursuit of misery. Evil is something that wills pain for its own sake. Evil is not absence, it's action. And one friend offered a philosophical reflection, which I've shortened considerably, but which I think is excellent. Evil is subjective because all concepts such as evil are subjective perspectives on the other. What's evil to you might not be evil to me. Norms in the end are cashed out subjectively, but they work their way into intersubjective norms. We tend to personify evil because it makes the world easier to understand. So what are we really talking about when we talk about evil? Is it a force in the world like gravity? Is it something we can capture in a genie's lamp or a Pandora's box? Is it something we can be exorcised from by a priest? Or is it something which runs through the heart of every person? Now, to discuss the topic of evil, we have somebody who has thought a lot about evil doing and how humans manage to do evil on a mass scale. We have psychologist, author, educator, and philosopher, Dr. Michael Hardiman. How are you, Mike?
Well, hi, Dahi. That is a very good introduction. I'm struck immediately by the variety of the different answers that people give and the range of thinking from philosophically, looking at it from the point of view of the notion of subjectivity, which of course is very important too, given examples of it. So I suspect really that, just to start off that piece, that nearly everybody has some comprehension or some idea that they hold about evil doing or evil itself as a concept. And I often think about, and from our previous conversations, how we frame things tend to influence what we do with them and how we react in the world with them. So whatever our understanding or non-understanding of evil doing will affect where we see it and how we see it. And I think that's one of the things I think that struck me when I began to investigate this subject more thoroughly.
Why did you begin to investigate this, Mike? I mean, most people run away from evil, or at least turn away from it. Maybe that's part of the problem. But you've leaned into it and you've looked a lot into it. You've written books on it. Why?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I don't think that my primary interest was actually in evil. My primary interest came from my interest in suffering. And I think that the moment that you engage with human suffering, you will need to draw a line eventually back to its source. And once you begin to draw a line back to the source and follow a path to the source of human suffering, you begin to engage and to bump up against evildoing. But most of my career was spent, in fact, focusing on suffering. I mean, my work as a psychotherapist, as a counselor, and that even goes back further, right back into my teenage years. As a young person, I witnessed a lot of suffering as a young person. And I think these formative experiences tend to influence what we end up doing in our lives. I think James Hillman talks about the soul's code, that there's nearly a code in the human being that you can see in their childhood. It's not deterministic in the sense that, bad things happen, so whatever. but more that some people can remember that even as a young person, they had a deep curiosity or passion about something. And for lots of different reasons that I don't need to go into, I had a great empathy and a great care for the problem of suffering. And that's what led me into the field of psychology. And I spent most of my career in that path. And so my concern and my efforts and my productive years were spent, and I still have productive years, but the main focus was on what do we do to alleviate suffering, particularly suffering that has happened as children, and formative suffering, trauma, all the stuff that goes on that anybody born in the 50s and 60s in Ireland will have actually traversed through during their years. They would have witnessed a lot of it, because I think the suffering that children went through during those periods was very real. And so I spent most of my time and my effort then trying to understand how that manifests itself in adulthood and what can be done about it. So my focus was very much on the victims. I don't like the word victim. I prefer to use the word casualty. The casualties of suffering and trauma, and how do people recover, and how do people flourish, and how do people heal. And that was the vast bulk of my career, really, and all my early writing, my work, my books on that were about that. That led me then, we'll say then, there was a period of time then it led me on to this, into the subject of addiction. And I spent about a decade focusing very much on the power of addiction in the human psyche, and how it damages people, and creates the victims surrounding people who are addicted as well as the addict themselves. So I spent a number of years really focusing on that, and did a lot of work around that, wrote on that. And then I think I began to feel, it wasn't that I was stagnating, but I just felt like, okay, I can spend a lot of time focusing on the survival, on the healing, on the recovery, but I want to look at what's doing it, what's causing it, where does it come from? And that brought me then into the field of looking at human evil. And psychology as a discipline, I think, is weak when it comes to this issue. And I think the reason it's weak is because I think it has been profoundly impacted by an ideological understanding of human nature that actually I think it tries to bypass evil. And that's why evil is not a subject that people want to talk too much about. It doesn't smell right for a lot within the academic world, because because it has such a connection to religion. And so it's like, if we can find other words for it, then, we'll find it. And we can talk about dualism and the primitive view of evil in a few minutes. But essentially, I think philosophy was a better gateway. So I went back and studied philosophy, and went through the formal training in philosophy over a period of a decade, and then wrote my PhD on the subject of evil, particularly mass evil, which is, because when people think of evil, and this is where we talk about the word evil, people tend to think about monstrous evil, the monstrous, the bad, the really, really horrible, awful. I mean, this is why people love crime thrillers. I mean, serial killers robbing children and killing them and strangling them and drowning them, burying them in the forest, and the way the forces of good have to try and get them. And it's a kind of fairy tale narrative nearly, which is the bad guys are out there, but the good guys are going to get them. It's that kind of, and it's very deep in our psyche that we see it like that. But evil is much more complex, and most evil, as Hannah Arendt said, is caused by people who never decided whether to be good or evil. And that's the bit that really grabbed me.
Yeah, I've talked to a friend of mine about evil, and I asked him the same question. Yeah, he's studying neuroscience, so he's very much a science based
Yes.
person, and he immediately said, "Oh, it's an archaic concept that has no use."
Yeah.
Pretty much in today's world, and that's kind of the attitude that you're describing there. But do you think it
Yes.
has use? Or do you think it has use, or do you think there's a truth to it? You know what I mean? Because those things are different. That it's
I
useful to
think
describe things like this, or
I think both. I
both.
think
Okay.
it has use, and I think there is a truth in it. Yes.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing, because we're back now to the use of language. What's the does evil refer to a concept that has truth, validity? Is it something that we can say means something verifiable, that we can say, yeah, this, in some ways, this has really got to do with the way we use language. I can choose to use the word evil, or somebody else can use the word wicked. Nobody is in denial that humans can be very destructive. So when we use the euphemism like destructive or violent or aggressive or whatever, that's all good and fine. But evil brings something of the morality into it that's a little bit different. And the reason evil is not used very much, the way people talk about it, is that I think that there's an ideological bias against that. I think when we talk about destructiveness and violence and aggression, I think subconsciously even we can feel like we're maybe more in control of it. We can do something about that. We can treat that. We can fix that. And that comes from the more privation or privative understanding of human evil as the absence of the good. So if we can see that, then we know that if we put in the good things, then evil will disappear. And that's one of the great fantasies of a lot of modern thinking, that if we put a lot of good things into the world, evil will disappear. In other words, evil is not real. Evil is only the reaction, the absence of the good. That's a privative theory of evil that grew up through Catholicism, through Christianity, because the presence of evil in the world. I don't know whether we're getting into the weeds here on the two different theories of evil that have emerged.
Yeah, let's tell people the difference between the privative and the dualist theories. Yeah.
So generally, when we're looking at whether evil has a validity, we ask the question: is it real? We can see then, you go back through the history and say, well, how did human thinking evolve around human evil? What were the systems of thinking? So basically, we go back to the narrative of the fall, the human being, Adam and Eve, the metaphor of that, and then, but particularly in the West, fundamentally, our way of framing issues of good and evil come through the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has a secular version which was embraced through the Enlightenment. And the difficulty that was facing the theologians and the thinkers of that time was that it became very, very difficult to justify the level of evil that existed in the world if it had been created by a benevolent, omnipotent, good, loving creator. So this produced a tremendously difficult intellectual puzzle for the people who wanted to hold on to the fundamental piece that God created the world and created male, female, created the animals, created all the rest of that, and that God loves, that this is his creation and that we are his children and he loves us. And he's the ultimate of beauty, of creativity, of intelligence. It's all bound up in the divine. You say, right, if that your fundamental ground being is the divine, which is benevolent and good and omniscient, how then do we explain the levels of suffering and pain and tragedy and destruction that's in the world? So that's a terribly difficult philosophical problem. You've got to square that away somewhere. So St. Augustine would have been the one that really, more than anybody, fought with this and came up with a solution. It took another 1,200 years after that for Leibniz to call this argument theodicy. And theodicy is the system by which you justify the existence of God in the face of evil. And so what Augustine did, he produced quite a neat solution here, which I don't think works, but his neat solution was that evil is simply the privation of the good. You cannot have evil without good. And it's the corruption of the good that is the definition of evil. That's the privative view. It's the privation of the good. And the best metaphor used for explaining that is the notion of light and darkness. So we say, and when we think about goodness and evil and good, then people think the light and the darkness. And that kind of metaphor is used in songs, in prayer, and, and even in the creation myth, the darkness hovered over the deep, and it's all around. Darkness is all around. But when you actually think about this, and the reason why that metaphor is used is that light has substance. Light has you cannot get light without substance. Sunlight is the nuclear explosions or whatever in the sun. When you light a candle, you're burning the wax. It's energy. It is a positive energy that exists, and it exists through the combustion of the atoms and molecules. I'm not a scientist, but that's, you know what I mean. And that's light. When you blow out the light, you have darkness. Darkness has no substance. There is no substance called darkness. So this is the metaphor that helps people understand a privation view, or the privative theory of evil, is that evil is simply the absence of the good. And once we hold on to that, that means that the ground of all being is the good. This solved the theodicy problem. The dualist view. So the dualist view said, no, evil is way too powerful than that. And so they came up with based on the Eastern philosopher Mani, the Manichaean heresy, which is that there's two worlds. There's a good world and there's an evil world. And the Manichaeans thought that the evil world belonged in the flesh, and that the good world belonged in the spirit. So anyway, so asceticism and all the rest of that became part of that. But fundamentally, as concept, what they were saying was, no, there's two worlds. There's a good world and there's an evil world, and evil is real. And so that began the notion of dualism. And so certain theologians then took that on board and went back to the story of the fall. And the fall meant that evil entered the world and evil was real. It wasn't just the absence of the good now, and therefore human beings were born with original sin. There was a fundamental flaw in human nature now that was not just the absence of good, but a disposition or a predisposition to sin. So this is where all the sacraments then had to be created. They had to create a whole kind of methods and systems in order to save the human being. So the salvation doctrine, redemption, and all that, from a religious point of view, came into the world, and that's a huge path in Christendom. But all of this changed then during the Enlightenment, when Max Weber and his pals demystified the world, and Nietzsche told us that God was dead. There was a gradual diminution of the power of Christianity as an explanatory system. So we're left then, okay, what do we do with human evil then, if this is simply the situation? So then, but the two views still existed, the privative view and the dualist view came and took on secular clothes. They are now dressed up in a secular clothes, and the high priest of the privative view was our old friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the romantic, the noble savage. This notion that in this there was an idyllic world. And only until the Enlightenment, rationalism and science and all of that stuff just ruined it all for everybody. We got private property and people became greedy and selfish and horrible and all the rest of that. But fundamentally, human beings are good. And John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians came on board as well. And the Enlightenment and this was the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were periods of enormous positivity and optimism about human beings. So that has affected every single strand of modern Western civilization. That thinking, that fundamental core thing, it's in education, it's in psychology, it's in therapy, it's in our system, that we don't want to think there's anything really fundamentally wrong with the human being that can't simply be fixed by social change. The privative view of human evil leads us into social engineering and social construction. Alongside this, then, we had Hobbes, tooth and claw. We had people who said, no, it's not that simple. And then you had Freud came along then, and his understanding, which was that man is a barely civilized animal, essentially. We have developed capacities for goodness, but we are still aggressive and narcissistic and fierce. And his later work, Civilization as Discontents, that civilization is a problem for the human animal. We will find that we have instincts that are constantly destructive. He called this the death instinct. So, and then evolutionary psychology came along on top of that. So evolutionary psychology in the 70s and 80s, maybe 80s and 90s, evolutionary psychology was gaining ground in the academy because it made a lot of sense. which was that human beings are evolved animals with massive possibilities and potential for destruction and violence, and that our human history is really good proof for that. We're the only animal species that slaughters millions of its own species, and can for all kinds of weird reasons do terrible harm and suffering. So the dualist view. So you've got the psychoanalytic aspect of the dualist view, which is that the human being is, these are called conflict theories of evil. The human being is in a conflict between good and evil. Every human being has a conflict within themselves because they have impulses that lead them into it. And they're real impulses, and they exist. And they're not simply just because you were poor or just because you got hurt or whatever. You have them. They're there. And they're a heritage of your animal ancestry. So Freud brought that to bear, and also the invention of the unconscious and understanding. It's interesting. Just before we started, we were talking about Jonathan Haidt's idea of freedom. I don't know whether and the notion that where actually reason is. It's essentially where you talk a little bit about that. How you brought that up.
Okay, yeah, it's the notion of free will, and it is a big topic, I guess, in philosophy, whether we do have free will or not. And the way I've settled on this in my own thinking is I use the metaphor of Jonathan Haidt when he talks about our capability for reason above our kind of animal instincts. And he talks about the rider and the elephant. So that the human animal is like an elephant, and it moves through the world with a lot of power, with not a lot of foresight, with not a lot of intuition, because it doesn't have language, it doesn't think rationally. But then we can take that rational human being, and we can see them as the rider upon the elephant. So then the rider upon the elephant, you never have full control over the elephant. I mean, it is an elephant after all. So it's going to move through the world. But what you can do is you can get better at soothing the elephant. You can get better at directing the elephant. And for me, that's where free will lies, in recognizing that we are a rider on an elephant. So paradoxically, the first step to realizing that we have free will is realizing that we don't have free will, that we are an animal, and that we have to somehow take control and be better riders upon the elephant. And in that way, we increase our will, our free will, and our agency in the world. So that's how I like to see Jonathan Haidt's Rider and the Elephant. I think it explains it well.
Yes. So in some ways, it's a very useful sort of confirmation of a dualist understanding of human evil. So whichever one of those we accept. Now there are other sort of grades in between. So, but we don't need to get into the weeds on that. We can say that fundamentally these are two understandings. That's going to drive how we understand, how we go at the problem of human evil. That's the piece. And so that would have been my first foray into a deepening understanding of human evil, which takes you into, and you look at people who have before us, the right, a lot of the issues around evil were not actually approached within the academy. They were approached in literature. Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness, Shakespeare's Iago, Moby Dick. These are, and then of course the great moral philosopher is Dostoevsky, and his focus there. If you want to get a good understanding of human evil in terms of a theory of evil, then Brothers Karamazov pits the two together in the most wonderful way, and then Crime and Punishment, of course, as well. So there's an enormous, rich source of understanding of evil without having to go into the field of psychology at all, just by reading some of this. And I can remember reading The Lord of the Flies. There were two books when I was 16 years of age that really touched me in relation to this subject. And it's so strange, this whole thing with Hillman's thing about the soul's code, that I came back 40 years later to revisit this in a different way. And The Lord of the Flies, the notion that, that turning away from this utopian view of, the beautiful island and actually the really messy, horrible parts of human nature showing themselves. instead of the boy's own version, which I thought was really. And the other one that I read was All Quiet on the Western Front. And All Quiet on the Western Front really touched me because I can remember very clearly, and this goes back to because we'll be talking about ideology in a little while, and the role ideology plays in evil. When the main character carries his friend back, his friend dies and he carries him for miles and he dies. And then he's on furlough and he goes back. This is 2 years. He's 2 years into the war and he goes back to his village. And the schoolmaster is shouting the same ideological slogans to the students, getting them ready to get tugged out, to dress up, to go to the front. And it's just so poignant, the way it's written. And I can remember identifying with this young man, even though I was only 16, he was probably, but the character in it was probably about 19, I'd say, 19, 20, having seen the absolute horror of what this person was screaming at them as ideological pure. So it lay there dormant for a long time, and then it emerged when I started studying ideology and the relationship between evil and ideology. So the dualist understanding, the privative understanding, you probably can guess already which way I'm actually going on this one. So for me, evil is real. It's a positive force. The people who hold on to this, is one guy, Nozick, he's a moral philosopher, and he talks about it in mathematical terms. He said, if you think about positive and negative, the privative view is you look at the X and Y axis and there's a zero. And from zero up to the top is all the good. So you can't get evil. Zero is evil is there in the zero, but it doesn't go down to the negative. In other words, but he says it does. Evil is a positive force of negativity in the world and that exists. And I think that model, and the person I could quote, I'm going to read a quotation because I think it really, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Because there's one from Solzhenitsyn. And if you want to talk about somebody who might understand something about human evil, I think Solzhenitsyn is a good man, because oftentimes the buzzword now is lived experience, Yeah. So if you want to talk about somebody who understands the lived experience of evil, Solzhenitsyn is a very good source for that. But he says, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil.
I hear yin and yang in that.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're not demonizing somebody. This is the older version of the demonology would be the demon is the total depravity of man. That was I think that was what's his name? One of the theologians, the Genevan guy, the very strict Protestant. Can't remember. Anyway, it'll come to mind. The total depravity, the theology of total depravity was part of strict Protestantism. No. So I think Solzhenitsyn pictures here. So
okay. So going forward with you're not of the privative view. You don't think that evil is simply the absence of good.
No.
Evil is actually something that's in the world. It's a force in the world that we have to deal with.
Yes.
And it's a force. It's a capacity that's inside all of us. Okay. Do we have a definition that we can use?
Okay, so this takes us then to the issue of, like, what are we actually talking about in terms of what is this? We know it's real. What is it? So we can take one of two views, and philosophers usually try to complicate things. They'll use language, and you think, oh my God, could they not have just said that a bit easier? And part of that is just solipsism. It's just showing off.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's two views really. One is called a deontological, which actually just means it's got to do with something before anything happens. It's Kantian understanding that it's a capacity within the human being to do evil, to create evil. It's almost like intentionality, but it's not related to its consequence. In other words, it's there, but we don't relate it to any consequential act. We don't define it by its consequence. So that has to do with disposition, intention, rather than consequence. The consequentialist view focuses on what's the consequence? And I am very strongly influenced by this, because I think when we're defining evil, we need to define it in some kind of practical terms, in terms of what does it do? What does it mean to do evil? And then when you go there, you say, right, can you separate that from other types of behavior? Is evil an extreme form? And then, of course, it is. This is why it's called evil. This is why we use the word, to separate it from bad or wrong or illegal. We need something that can capture our moral language. We need something that can capture a sense of horror after the awfulness of it. And that's why the word evil suits me. So I'm going back to a conservative philosopher who helped me to understand this. His name is John Keats. And he defines evil as causing grave, undeserved suffering, harm, and loss to another human being. So he's defining evil by its consequence. Kant talks about it in terms of what your intention is, and that it's your motivation that defines whether something is evil or not, rather than the consequence of it. Both of these have a lot of value, but I'm staying with a consequentialist view. So, and this is because when I started earlier on talking about suffering, when you draw the line from suffering back into the evildoer, you're looking at the consequence, and then you're going back to see what produced it. So it produces something. So I'm inclined to view evil by what it produces. Evil doing is what produces grave, undeserved harm and suffering. And that harm and suffering doesn't have to be physical, often is. So an evil act is one that does that. But let's say that that's John Keats, his view. Now he leaves out intentionality for lots of different philosophical reasons, where I would put in intentionality. I don't think we can talk about human evil without talking about intentionality. Going back to what you were saying, Dahi, about free will, you have to intend this at some level, not, but there has to be a level of intentionality that you're doing this, because otherwise, if I go out and I haven't slept very well and I drive and I'm very tired and I've been listening to the radio and there's nice music on and I'm just not thinking of what I'm doing, I'm a bit tired, and I drive over a cyclist and kill him. Right. I'm responsible for maybe not taking good enough care about my driving, but I did not intend. That is not an evil act insofar as its consequence. That consequence is terrible. If the guy that's cycling in front of me is my neighbor whose dog is barking all night long, and I hate him because I've asked him 100 times to shut the dog up, and I say, "Let this for a game of cowboys. He's not going to look after the dog, but I'm going to look after him," and I drive over him. That's an intentional act causing grave suffering and harm. One is evil, one is not. So, but there is another piece to this puzzle, and that is, maybe I can get somebody else to do evil for me. Maybe I want to evade the responsibility. And this means that I can actually maybe get somebody that I can influence to do an evil act. And Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist that's famous for the Stanford prison experiment, this was his contribution to the conversation. There's lots of things that he's done that are really helpful in understanding. We can get into it later, about how evil operates in the world. But one of the things he adds to this is, if you use your resources to get somebody else to do it on your behalf, if you have power, this goes back to the relationship between evil and power. If you have power over somebody and you can get them to do this, then you're as morally responsible for that as if you did it yourself. So in other words, like if you take somebody and if you have a knife and you stab somebody, that knife is an extension of you. Heidegger loved this. He uses the hammer, I mean, the tool becomes an extension of the individual. It's no longer an external thief. So your knife is your weapon, but it's an extension of you. Well, if you get somebody else to do it, then they have become the extension of you, and then the knife is the extension of them. So if you use your power to get other people to do evil, you are morally responsible for it. So our definition of evil then is causing grave, undeserved suffering and harm to another human being, or using your power or resources to get someone else to do it. That's our definition.
That's a good definition.
Yes, but it's not fully comprehensive definition.
Yeah.
And that's really important I'm not claiming but I would say that if you use that as your definition of evil, you're probably covering 80% of the evil that goes on in the world.
I think so. The problem I have with trying to prove intention when viewing evil is uh, Israel. To be honest with you, genocide. Genocide is known as the crime of crimes, so we can call it the evil of evils, the
Uh-huh.
crime of crimes.
Yes.
To prove that genocide has taken place, because of clever wording back in 1948, I think, it has to be proved that there is intent to do all the things, the displacement, the murder, the killing of a tribe of people, or of a certain category of people. Then that becomes genocide if you can prove intent. But in societies that are very legalistic, and America and Israel are the two top legalistic militaries in the world, and that they have lawyers embedded in them, then wording can be put together to make everything sound like it's done for a military logic. And what this does is it avoids that intent. So while the consequences can be horrific, which they are, but what's going on right now, children starving, children being murdered, as long as the language that comes from the perpetrators is all about military logic, and you can hear this in Putin as well, is all about military logic, then the accusations of evil or genocide can there be avoided. And that's why I kind of lean into what you're saying about the consequentialist view, that it's probably more apt if we could say, no, that is genocide because of its consequences,
Yeah.
not to do with intention. So I when looking at what's happening now in Gaza, I do think uh, the consequentialist view of evil and the consequentialist view of
Yeah.
genocide should be taken into account. But sorry for that brief aside, Mike. Now,
Not at all. No, no. I think it's a very useful. I think it's very good to tease that out a little bit, because intention, proving intention, and having intention are two different things. That's fructose. So we could say, right, I don't actually really believe that they're using the legalistic term, but I think deep down there is intention. So, but we may not be able to prove it. So this is where the whole issue of evil, whether we can prove it or not, is a slightly different piece. If we stay within the comprehension of evil as causing grave suffering and harm, and the other piece is, if you know that this is going to be the result,
yes,
that's the other.
there's
Yeah,
intention, and there's foreseeability.
yeah,
Those two things,
yeah.
yeah,
And so if you say, well, we're not really intending it, but we know it's going to happen, where does we still have a moral responsibility for what we're doing,
yes.
because this is the consequence of our behavior. But I don't want to get too stuck down in that. But anyway, that's the consequence. So, okay, so for now, anyway, here right now we have two fundamental different understandings of evil. I'm coming down on the side of the notion that evil is a positive force in the world, in the sense that it's a positive negative force in the world. It's deeply destructive. It lies in the heart of every human being. Its potential is, and the potential and it's about causing grave suffering and harm. So when you find grave suffering and harm, you draw a line. You go back to the source and say, right, what's happening there? Then we get to the roots. Then we get to understanding what's causing the evil. And now we're into a very different conversation, which is, there's a whole range of possibilities. And this is my own work on the study of evil, is that once we go there, now we discover there's a whole template, there's a whole menu of all kinds of ways that comes about. And the least, in terms of quantity, is a really horrible, selfish, narcissistic, violent human being going down the street and murdering somebody. That's reported on the news, and everybody goes, oh, that's a tiny proportion of the evil in the
Yeah.
world.
Mm.
And yet it's the one that everybody, that everybody
Yeah.
thinks of.
Yeah, it's the picture that we get in our head of the
But
serial killer, or as you
yeah,
say, but that's
yeah.
not actually where the most evil is taking place.
Not at all. Not at all. Not a minuscule.
Somebody
Minuscule.
who somebody who writes a lot about this, and you might be able to tell us why they are so important in your thinking and in the study of evil, is Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
Why
Hannah
is she
Arendt,
so important?
Hannah Arendt, more than anybody, although she would say that she never developed a theory of evil, um, which is, I think, in and of itself interesting. And it's probably true. I think one of the reviewers of my book, and I don't want this to come across as arrogant, but one of the things that he did say was that he said that I've managed to explicate a theory of evil from Arendt's work. In other words, like that what was in her work, and I would say it's in her work. I just explicated, I teased it out a bit, and I found these amazing sort of connections that actually add up to what could be called a theory of mass evil, of mass evil. But Arendt is an absolute rock star when it comes to understanding human evil, because of, first of all, her life experience. It's very rare to find somebody who has the kind of combination of qualities. First of all, she was incredibly intelligent, and anybody that reads Kant at 14 and enjoys it has to get out more.
That's for sure.
She had an outstanding intellect. That's the first thing. She's a passionate intellectual person who wrote a PhD on Augustine and love, I think. So really, really interesting human being. But she was a Jew in Germany, and she was exposed firsthand. She was arrested in 1933. She escaped by charming the Gestapo officer who couldn't really, and she got out and she went to France. And there she was arrested again by the Vichy government and was held in an internment camp in Gurs. And it was very chaotic. The Vichy government hadn't fully tied itself in with the Gestapo fully. So there was an opportunity, a window to get out. And herself and about 200 got out of 7,000 people. And most of those then, 3 or 4 weeks later, were actually sent to Dachau and eventually ended up in either in Auschwitz and were exterminated. So she understood, she saw it happening. And this is her own personal life experience. She went to America. And then she studied and read and became a very profound. She then felt that philosophy, she wouldn't call herself a philosopher for a long time. She called herself a political theorist, which is true. And then later on in life, she reverted back to embracing philosophy as a title for herself. So she had the life experience, the intellectual depth, the philosophical depth, and the political nous, we'll say, and brought them all together in understanding how human beings get lost under totalitarianism and how their morality dies. And that's the origin of totalitarianism. She talks about, because it's about what is happening to the moral person. Morality was considered to be the thing that saved us from human evil. Conscience, the code, a moral code, will, which is your capacity for making choices. These were the things that actually, the power to make choices, to obey the rules of your conscience, which the code, the moral code. And she discovered that model completely collapsed under totalitarianism. So that, and what I've done in the work that I've done on Arendt, because I bring psychology and history, sociology and everything else into bear on this, I'm not an Arendtian scholar in that sense. My focus is simply on her understanding of human evil and all the different dynamics that went on to create what would stand out as the iconic examples of evil in the world, which would be the Stalinist and the Hitlerian regimes, where human life became completely dispensable. And this is one of her things about, she calls radical evil. When the human becomes totally disposable, you are now you're now in hell. This is it. And how can societies, particularly the German society, the Weimar, post-Weimar, the most intelligent, most well-educated, most sophisticated, most industrialized society descend into a murder machine? How does that happen? And so that's her understanding. And there were all kinds of evils throughout history, as we know, the slaughter of the Templars, right throughout. We can see all these massacres, but the thing about the Holocaust and Holodomor is we have the information. We have the information. We understand the dynamics more clearly because we have all the records. It's recent history. So this can give us a window into, it's not that it's new. Slaughtering people goes back to time immemorial, but how human progress, the other thing about progress, if we talk about Rousseau and human progress, again, the primitive view is that would have an implication that human progress will mean we'll get better. But it doesn't. It just means we'll get better at being bad and we'll be better at being good. The dualist will say, whatever our potentials, however our capacities. So the chip that runs your washing machine or that actually helps the machine that keeps you alive when you're on life support or when you're under anesthetic or whatever. I was under an anesthetic last week. So
lovely.
I woke up and I thought, wow, because I just was looking at the lights and it wasn't one of those lights. It wasn't a near death experience. Now it was just, I just went under and came up and this lovely nurse said, your operation is over. And I just thought, what an amazingly wonderful thing that we have in this world. That's human development. That's human positivity. So the little chips that are actually keeping that alive are also the ones that sending the missile exactly into the apartment that's slaughtering 15 people.
Yeah.
The problem is not with the chip. The problem is not with the progress. The problem is not with the technology. The problem is with the people who are doing it. So progress. So Arendt understood this. And so she understood that the Holocaust was the natural progression of industrialized murder. If you're going to industrialize murder, you can do it very efficiently. And that's what the Nazis were able to do. But it gives us a window into,
Yeah, no, you've mentioned Zygmunt Bauman in your book as well a couple of times, and that's very much his ideas as well, isn't it? Following on from that.
Yeah, he says that rationality, and nowhere throughout the whole Holocaust would rationality not have been at work. He thought, it was completely rational once you had accepted the fundamental ideological position.
What then are the types of evil that you've explicated from like Hannah Arendt's work?
Well,
you've broken them down.
I have, yeah. She does not spend much time at all actually talking about what we consider, when we were earlier talking about the monstrous man that goes down and murder. She didn't give it as much attention at all because she thought that's simple. He's just a bloody savage criminal, primitive, bad-minded, whatever, murderous individual. We don't have much of a problem understanding that. That's straightforward. What she was more interested in is people who are not like that, who are engaging in evildoing. So there are two enormous strands in her thinking. The one that she got most hell for was her development of the concept of the banality of evil. This was her study of Adolf Eichmann at the Eichmann trial. And she lost friends, and people just really, they called her a self-hating Jew. I mean, it really, it created a storm of certain form, which I can't use on the podcast, but I'm a certain kind of
fire
storm.
away, Mike. Fire away. It's that kind of podcast.
It's storm.
Yeah. All right.
Oh my God. Yeah. They hated it. When she analysed Eichmann at his trial in Jerusalem, the Mossad captured him from Argentina in 1960 and brought him for a trial in Jerusalem. And she actually objected to that. She thought he shouldn't have been brought to Jerusalem. She saw that as a show trial. She thought he should have been brought before the Court of Human Rights or the European Criminal Court in Germany. But that aside, anyway, she was asked to cover the trial. And when she saw Eichmann, now a lot of people kind of think that she saw Eichmann and then she made up this notion of the banality of evil. That's actually not true. She understood this concept of what she called the banality of evil much earlier on when she was writing Origin of Totalitarianism, where she saw that the ordinary German people who were engaging and collaborating under the Nazi regime at all levels of society were collaborating with the murder machine. she saw what she called the desk murderers, the people who were engaging all that. But Eichmann became for her the best prototype of that. Because that's exactly his defense. His defense is, I never killed anybody. I was just doing my job. I was a kind of an advanced administrator. I was asked to administrate this. I was doing my duty to the Führer. And of course, Eichmann, for those who are not familiar with him, if you would think about the number of people who are involved in murdering, would be the most evil human that ever walked the planet, because he's directly responsible for organizing the transportation, which was extremely difficult to do, a very complicated job, and he was fully and totally immersed in doing it and did very well, to transport all of the European Jews to the death camps in Auschwitz. And so Eichmann presented himself as this bureaucrat, as this unthinking bureaucrat. And she says about him, when she saw him, she could see nothing monstrous about him, nothing particularly idealistic about him, nothing fanatical about him. Now, she was wrong about Eichmann. Eichmann was an absolute zealot, a Nazi zealot, but he hid it very, very well. And so the criticism that people make about Arendt was that she made all this up about Eichmann. It's not fair. She was fooled by his narrative, but because he was representing a form of evil that she called the banality of evil, because there were certain things she was not aware of. Later on, there's another book called The Diary of Eichmann Before Jerusalem, by Bethany Stagnett, which was and that was based on the tapes and the research in Argentina, where he met with all the other Nazis, and they had recordings of his stuff, and it was clear that he was an absolute dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. Arendt might say he was only showing off. That's what she might say, that he wanted to pretend that he was a zealot, but he wasn't really. He had been a kind of a salesman for his father, or a friend of his father gave him a job as a traveling salesman. And then when he was he started working for Mercedes car company, I think, and then tried his hand at rabbit farming in Argentina. And when you look at a photograph of Eichmann, in the later years, you think he just looks so harmless. So your picture of this terrible, ideologically driven Nazi just doesn't fit. So in her study of Eichmann, she saw that one of the fundamental attributes of his was thoughtlessness, that he never thought what he was doing. He never thought through the implications of what he was doing. So but she held him responsible for that, because it's not like he wasn't reasonably intelligent, but he refused to think. He did not. That's the whole thing. There's none so blind as those who will not see. So she saw that it suited him to remain thoughtless about what he was doing and not take responsibility for it. And so,
what do you mean by not thinking there, Mike? Because are we not all thinking all the time? What's this thoughtlessness?
Yeah, this is interesting, because Arendt has a particular understanding of what thinking is, and she believes that thinking has a very strong connection to our morality, which she is using thinking in the Socratic form. She was, of course, deeply philosophical and very, very, she was a real fan of Socrates, I think, And Socrates used to talk about the 2-in-1 conversation, the conversation with yourself. This is the self-reflection on what you're doing. Whereas you can see thinking in terms of problem solving, which is a slightly different thing. If you look at thinking as a problem solving, you devote your cognitive apparatus to solving the problem. You're not thinking up the implications of how you're solving it. You're thinking of solving the problem. So she makes this distinction, and one of the most fascinating and horrifying descriptions of this is in Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men. Christopher Browning went back and interviewed the Hamburg order police, who were sent to support the Einsatzgruppen in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. This was a group of order police. So these would be kind of traffic wardens. They were older than the other soldiers. They were kind of traffic warden types. Order police, that's the name. It was a battalion of them in Germany, in Hamburg, which was the least anti-Semitic city in Germany at the time. So that 500, they were sent into Czechoslovakia, and their first job was to slaughter all the Jews in a village called Josefrau. And Christopher Browning went back and interviewed them afterwards about how this worked and how it happened. And from his view, he could see that some of them were very unwilling to do it. They were given the choice; they didn't have to do it, but most of them said, "We will do it." But they did it out of loyalty to each other. They did it. They hated it. They vomited. They cried. They were deeply, deeply upset. And they came back, and the commanding officer gave them more whiskey or vodka. Well, whiskey, actually, yeah. They didn't do the vodka until they got further into Russia. But anyway, and here was a picture that Christopher Browning began to understand something about what Arendt had been talking about thoughtlessness, about not, and he went on then to study that further. And he discovered the dialogue or the correspondence between the engineers in Germany who were designing the carbon monoxide vans to exterminate in the euthanasia program. The Nazis practiced they were trying to figure out how to gas the Jews, but they didn't know how to do it very well. They wanted to get an efficient form, so they thought carbon monoxide might be the way to do it. So in order to do that, they created these vans, and they had set up the euthanasia program. So the engineers were talking to each other about how to work the vans, how to design them. So all of their communication with each other were about the valves, the air inlets, the sluices, because obviously there are quite a few, seemingly there's quite complex business here, because once all the people are in the van, you close the door and they're all dead, you have to take them out and you have to clean the van, and you don't want the next group of people to actually know that you're going to die in this van. So the euphemisms of fluids and whatever, that's like vomit and feces and urine and all of that. They don't use any. So again, here's a moral distance from the actual reality of what you're doing. They're focusing on the technical things. So Arendt would see this is thoughtlessness, because even though you're using your intelligence, and these people were highly intelligent, they were the engineering class, they're using their cognitive apparatus to think how to solve the problem. So that's one form of thinking, instrumental thinking. But reflective thinking is a different element, which is when you're having the conversation with yourself about the meaning of what you're doing. So when Arendt talks about thoughtlessness, she does not mean that you're not intelligent, and it doesn't mean that you don't think. It means you don't think about the meaning of what you're doing. That's the bit. So she's gotten a lot of criticism because of this word thoughtlessness, because people don't tease out this. Now, ironically, she doesn't really tease it out either. I tease it out in the work I'm doing in relation to figuring out what does she mean, because and she does say this, highly intelligent people can be thoughtless. She does understand it, but she didn't tease it out maybe clearly enough to make that distinction. And that allowed her work to be open to this kind of criticism, because, as it turns out, Eichmann wasn't really that thoughtless. He knew what he was doing, but he hid it. But there were so many others who, like those engineers, when they went home at night, I remember writing a paragraph once about this, and I remember writing a PhD, or when I was thinking of turning the work I was doing into book, my supervisor talking to Felix in the philosophy department, he said, it doesn't really work like it doesn't fit. But I wrote a paragraph, a kind of a thought experiment about Hans going home to his wife, all worried, Gertrude, and she's giving him a cup of tea and soothing his brow, because there's a problem with parts. One of the suppliers he's working in the machine shop, technical, whatever, and the parts haven't arrived, and the Gestapo have ordered certain things and we don't have them, and he's worried about it and he doesn't know what to do, and he rings them up the next morning, and then he comes home the next day and he's much relieved because they sent a courier with the parts. So everything is fine because the guillotines are going to be ready for delivery.
Yeah. That definitely paints a picture. It's like everything's going to be fine. What?
Yeah.
But it like my mind. It's very strange because we're talking about the Holocaust here, which is very real, very, as you were saying, a very traumatic part of our history. But now that Holocaust seems to have become part of an ideology that's justifying something very similar. When Arendt went to Eichmann in Jerusalem to the trial at that time, a lot say that Israel was nation building at the time, and they were kind of myth building as well to build their nation. So they wanted Eichmann up there as the epitome of evil, as this kind of demonic evil that the Jewish people and the survivors of the Holocaust had survived, and so that they really wanted this demonic picture, almost as a justification of what they were doing themselves, even at that time with the Nakba and things like this coming up. How do we stop, or is it possible, or what takes place that something like the Holocaust, that we can be so studious and study it and how did this come about, but then that can be used in a weird way as an ideological basis to do something very similar, and that thoughtlessness comes into play in that, because I imagine now that there's soldiers in Israel who have this thoughtless attitude now, who are going forward, oh, I have to do this, we have to clear this area, such and such a thing, and they're just not thinking about the consequences of the starving children, etc. Do you have anything to say about that, Mike? You know the kind of slight.
Well, I do, because it's, whether we talk about Israel or whether we talk about Rwanda or whether we talk about Pol Pot or whether we talk about Stalin or Mao or any of the vast sort of experiences of destroying innocent people, killing people, causing, because and you're so right to remind us that we're talking about the Holocaust, because when we talk about it, it can become an abstraction. And that's why I always keep coming back to this thing about suffering. The end point of what we're talking about here is actually suffering. That's the piece. And I just want to, and because even though I'm talking about it, it does not mean I would not have spent years of my life trying to get to do something with this without having a deep passion and empathy for what's happening in the world. And because I can speak so freely about it, it doesn't mean it doesn't affect me. I mean, I can remember when I started doing this study, I remember being up in the PhD room in the university, and I was reading the accounts of the nurses who were sent to the east to euthanize the other soldiers, the young soldiers that were wounded on the front, because Hitler couldn't feed them. So they send these nurses. And then the photographs of the secretaries going to work in Auschwitz, the young secretaries, the 20, 21-year-olds, the smiling photographs of them dancing outside Auschwitz and having fun. And you're there and you're embedded in this. And you might have read, we'll say, the slaughter of Babi Yar outside Kiev, which is the most, to read the description of that and not get sick is not easy. Not easy. Remember, I used to have to come out of this mind space and go down and have a cup of coffee. And I have a cup of coffee and I see these young people, all these young people. I was the elder lemon, like I was the oldest swinger in town. But, and they were all there, and the young lads were laughing, and the young girls were laughing, and all that goes on there, And I was thinking, take me back to Germany in 1930, 38, 39, 40. How many of these would be the secretaries going to Auschwitz to write how many of them would be working in the post office, typing in Germany, in Berlin, typing out the deportation orders? How many of them would be having fun after work, going for a drink? So it can kind of mess with your cup of coffee, and your scone.
Yeah. No, that's a problem of evil, isn't it? Messing with your coffee and your scone.
So the banality of evil is one of the strands, and the three elements I picked out on that were, one of them is thoughtlessness, the lack of self-reflection on the meaning of what I'm doing. That kind of thought. And Plato, of course, and his allegory of the cave is very important here, because he's thinking, his argument is most people don't want to do that.
Yeah.
When your man leaves the cave and finds that there's another world out there, and the cave is just a little, it's a world that people are enslaved into, and they think it's real and it's not, and he wants to tell them that, they kill him. So, and as Jesus says in the gospel, the prophet is not welcome in his own town. Somebody who, when you're bringing this kind of news to people to make them think. So thoughtlessness is not a natural position for a lot of people. It's uncomfortable. Now, some of that might be just fear, because there's a fear to really question the fundamentals, because where do you go? Where do you find an answer that you can ground yourself in. This is where ideology plays a hugely important part. So that's one piece of that banality puzzle, but obedience is another one. And again, Arendt has a very powerful argument to make about obedience. And she feels that we should take obedience out of the language of adulthood. Because people say, she would say, well, you know, the question is not why did you obey? The question is why did you consent? She says that adults consent. They don't obey, they consent. You're consenting to the authoritarian system. You've given a validity to this. So when you obey, it's not just, now she believes that if you're obeying because you're afraid or because you're under terrible duress, that has less moral, we'll say, implications for you as a human being than if you're consenting. But most people are consenting. They're consenting to the validity of the system. They're saying, actually, I'm okay with this. So a very classic, simple example of that is you're driving up and the traffic light goes red and you stop. Why do you stop? Maybe you're in a hurry. Maybe your needs are there, but say, no, I'm consenting. The reason why I'm going to get there in a reasonable amount of time is because the other cars aren't breaking the lights on the other side and we'll all be able to do it. We consent to this system because we can see that it has some kind of meaning and validity. And that's how we've chosen to solve the problem of traffic congestion. And if everybody consents to this, then it'll work. So consent can be a good thing, but I'm not obeying the law. I'm not stopping at the traffic light because I'm afraid of getting caught. I'm stopping at the light because I believe in the system. But this goes back to morality, which is, we will not be able to cover morality today because it's too big a subject and I need to do more thinking about it, to be honest with you. Because I am looking at the notion of moral maturity and how does this fit in the question of obedience. But obedience is another feature of banality because we'll say that Eichmann would have called this, well, I was obeying the law. I was obeying the rule of the Führer. And that's what everybody did. We just did what we were told. Now, the Nuremberg defense, that was the Nuremberg defense, said the courts afterwards said that is never going to be used as, that cannot be used as an excuse for criminal or evil behavior again, but people do it. And the third element of banality, so you've got two there, thoughtlessness, which is no self-reflection about the meaning of what you're doing, avoiding the responsibility by doing that, by the way. Secondly, giving the responsibility to somebody else and saying, well, I'm just obeying them, rather than that there's a moral choice in obeying. And that's called consent. You're guilty of consent, not obedience. So the third strand in the banality of evil is what she called, she doesn't tease these out now as much as I do, but they're in her work and they're in Eichmann, is role identification. I'm just a train driver. I drive trains. Where's your train going? It's going to Auschwitz. Okay. Where's the other train going? It's going to Salt Hill or whatever. I drive trains. The moral meaning of what I'm actually doing is outside of the role. The task is not evil. There's no driving a train is driving a train. That's a task orientation. This is where I give the example of the secretaries in Berlin sending out the deportation notices. If you go down to the county council offices today, there are people on a housing list. They're waiting for a house. The secretaries are there. The list comes up every day and they say, oh yeah, there's a house available in Corra Park or wherever that is. And then they look over at the other list and they say, now Mrs. Nugent, she's been on the list for 100 years. She's been on the list for
It's
5
likely
years.
these days, yeah, it's likely.
That fits there. So we'll tie these things. We'll call her up and we'll tell her we have a house for her. Could she attend? The task is exactly the same as, what's her name? Gertrude, writing out to Mrs. So-and-so and family, could they please attend to the station? They need to bring their suitcases with them. They need to for a resettlement. It's exactly the same task. So if you immerse yourself in the role and just hold that piece to be the moral responsibility, you also escape. So the banality of evil has these three strands, which is obedience, which is role immersion, and which is not, and thoughtlessness. The vast majority of the people who are engaged in collaborating with the Holocaust and in the Holodomor and in many of the other ideas operate like that.
Yeah.
But they would never, and she's so clear about this, she said they wouldn't have harmed a fly. The vast majority of these people would not have harmed a fly. ended up
Yeah.
murdering people because it was their job.
Because it was the job. That's horrific. In the book you use, it seems so long ago now, you use the example of what was happening at the border in America, where they were separating children from their parents, and the trauma and the suffering that was going to cause
Yeah.
in the
And
future.
I
Um,
deliberately used the same language as the Holocaust language, which was the same thing about, that, you got up in the morning, you kissed your children, you said your prayer, because, probably near the border, a lot of them would be Christian and evangelicals. They maybe had church the following the morning afterward, or after the day after, and they had a good sermon about love and Christianity and spirituality and being born again and all that. And mum and dad got up and dad put on his uniform or whatever. Maybe he was a bus driver and maybe mum's a social worker, and they kissed their kids and say, right, they're off to school, and then they go to work. And the social worker, she goes down to the office, and he gets the bus. And when he gets the bus, then he drives down to the cages and they bring these children that are crying into the bus. And he gets them all on, and maybe he prays that they'll have a safe journey, as Eichmann did. Eichmann was very upset about the fact that people were mistreating the Jews when they were being put on the trains. He thought, this is very inhumane. You shouldn't be doing this. There's no need for that. He thought that and so you drive the bus up to from the holding pens, then into another centre, and then the children are taken out, and then the doctors and the nurses, they take care of them and make sure they haven't got a scarlet fever or some terrible disease that will spread to other people, and they check them out and then maybe inoculate them or whatever. And then the paperwork goes over to Randy's wife, and she's there. She's a social worker, and she's at a meeting thinking, where are we going to send? Oh, there's a 2-year-old there, yeah. There's a family in Chicago about 5,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away. We think that they look like they're a good fit. You take a 3-year-old and you go and you send them off there. Then you pay that person, and that child is traumatized for the rest of their lives. And there's hundreds of children still not able to find their parents because of this. Not one of those people in that situation, in their own minds, did anything evil.
no, they just followed orders, as they say.
They
But
did what
that
they
that
believed was they believed this in the system.
That's it. It didn't like Arendt faced a lot of criticism afterwards as well, because she was kind of accused of victim blaming, because she was talking about how the Jews seemed to fall into some of these roles too during the Holocaust, and they seemed to just kind of fall into the role they were doing, and they didn't put up enough resistance. And as she said, a minimum amount of resistance could have saved many lives. Um, and that's not to blame the Jews for what's happening, or what happened, but that resistance is important, and when we think about what's happening in America right now, um, I worry about the system over there, that there isn't enough resistance. Although, thankfully, we do seem to be seeing pockets of resistance coming up, and people but
Yeah.
there's a lot of this obedience, a lot of this role immersion, people just doing their jobs, following along. That if
Well,
we have a podcast in another 10 years, we might be talking about what the people of America had done 5 years ago and how did they manage to do
I
it.
think we're already talking about it.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I think the seeds of totalitarianism are already there. I mean, it's in that authoritarian, and I don't want to get into the weeds here. I'll tell you why. Not because I don't have strong views on this, but because when someone is listening to this, I want them to be able to evaluate what I'm saying about evil doing without having to react to the fact that I might have a particular political position. Because
I
one of the
get you.
things that happens for people is, if they can pigeonhole you in a particular way, then they can stop listening to what you're saying. And
Yes,
for me
yes.
as a communicator, that's something that I really want to avoid, which is, now I've
Okay.
already shown my hand to some extent in relation to the
Yeah,
separation at the border, but I think that's okay so far. I
yeah,
think, that I don't think that would offend somebody who was doing that. I think that when they would maybe hear that, it might just, but what generally happens in the study of ideology, and that we'll go on to ideology in a moment, is it hardens the position. This is what's
yes.
so bloody paradoxical about this, is
Mm,
people become hardened in their position when they meet resistance. So this is the
yes.
paradox about, how do you help with this? How do we deal with that? There are people who are very ideologically strong, but the people I'm talking about here are not ideologically strong. They're just ordinary human beings. This is why I think Christopher Browning called his book "Ordinary Men." They were ordinary men. We all have feet of clay, and we all follow the rules to some extent, because that's a society cannot function without people cooperating with each other. So it's the very thing that helps our society to function that actually makes it go really badly wrong once the people in power start to guide the system. And this is key. None of what I've said about the banal evildoer is morally wrong in and of itself. There's actually nothing terribly badly wrong about being unreflective. Half the people in the world are unreflective. If they're living in a civilized society where actually there's a fairly strong moral code about decency and care, then a non-reflective person would be great.
Just muddle along, away you go. Happy days, yeah.
Obedient people, very important to have people that obey the rules. We obey the rules. We obey because otherwise we wouldn't stop at the traffic lights. But if we're not reflective, and this is why Arendt said something very interesting about morality in relation to this. She said morality stood on its head twice. And because when the Nazis took over and the document and the ideological frame changed, and people became collaborators at different levels with the murderous machine that was Nazi Germany. When the war was over, a great number of them went back to their original morality that they had let go of and picked up the pieces and everything was fine. And she said that should make us even more afraid, not less afraid, because it means that we're so malleable. So the banality of evil is not, and that's why she got in such trouble, because people said evil can never be banal. She was talking about the banality of the evil doer. And the evil that they did is the product of their banality. So that's what she meant by the banality of evil, is that this evil, which is horrific, has been produced by banal evildoers who have just put their energy and time into it. But that won't work. In a society where the fundamentals of the moral code of behavior is decent, banal people, non-thinking, obedient, conscientious workers will do just fine, and society will work. The thing that makes the difference is when the society embraces an ideological system which has evil as its outcome. Now, the evil may not be its intention. Let's go back to our intention. The evil may be the outcome. In order to reach the ideological goal, we have to end up causing grave suffering and harm and undeserved harm. So I'm saying that now rather than saying in order for the ideological goal to be met, we have to do evil, because nobody would do that. They would say, no. But if you say, well, we'll have to cause grave suffering and harm to a certain number of innocent people, they would say, yeah, you have to do that. So now, so therefore, when you have reframed, it's a bit like, the mathematical formula, A plus B is equal whatever. And if you just extend out the formula, now you can get at it more. So if you change the word evil and put in what we've defined evil as, then it makes complete sense. Vladimir Lenin now would be a great example of somebody who would absolutely put his hands up and say, you're absolutely right. There is no question in my mind, but it's actually going to take thousands and maybe millions. We will have to cause grave suffering, undeserved suffering to millions of people for our ideology to work. He knew it. Hitler knew it. Stalin knew it. Mao knew it. Pol Pot knew it.
And what about the millions? What about the millions who then enacted it? Because as you said, Eichmann, Hitler, Lenin, they actually probably didn't kill anybody themselves.
Exactly. Eichmann said he never killed anybody. Yeah. Hitler never killed anybody.
It was the banal evildoers. So do they have to understand at some level through an ideology that millions are going to have to die, and do they have to have that kind of accepted at some stage to carry out?
I think that's a really good question. The banal evildoer doesn't fully appreciate the importance of the one little piece that he's doing in the bigger picture. That's why when the Americans forced the villagers outside Auschwitz, I think it was Auschwitz, or was it Dachau, or one of the camps, to go in, and they all knew what was going on in the camps. This is where Bauman's moral distance comes in. The notion that the further you are distant from the actual doing, like I gave you the example of Himmler's speech at Posen, the soldiers, when they put on a show for him. Himmler went to Posen to look at how things were going, essentially. And the guys there said, look, the boss man, he's the head of the SS, like he's the main guy. We need to show him how it's working. We need to show how effective we are. I mean, it's not fair, really. He's there, he's doing his best. He's sending us trainloads of Jews, and, he needs, so we put on a show. So they put on a show, and they gathered 200 and something, 300 people, got them to take off their clothes, get into the ditch. Himmler standing in his greatcoat, massacred them all. Himmler went green. He was really upset by it. And particularly because his greatcoat got some brain splashed on it. So he wasn't right for a while afterwards. He came back and they had to give him a drink or whatever and sit him down and whatever. He's shaking his head. He said, this is terrible. This cannot go on. We have to find a better way to kill these Jews, because this is awful. Our soldiers are suffering.
Yeah, that's what was awful. But why? There must have been some move there that the soldiers' suffering was awful, but the other suffering was fine.
That's the ideological split. The reason why I'm bringing that up is a lot of the people who collaborated they didn't get the brain matter on their clothes. But you couldn't have got the situation that was happening at that time on the scale that was happening unless there were hundreds of thousands of people collaborating thoughtlessly to make this system work, from the person in the post office right through. But in order for the machinery to turn into an evil-doing society, essentially, an industrial machine of death, you need an ideological system that can convince a certain number of people that this is not only necessary, but it's right.
Yeah.
And
you need to have
that's the
one portion dehumanized.
Yes.
Is really the key as well, isn't it? That you need to dehumanize the other. So the bad that you're doing is to the soldiers who have to do this to the non-humans.
Yeah.
Almost.
Exactly. But that's the othering of them, and there's a couple of things that go on there then in terms of, so your ideological zealot will understand morality. See, here's the shift in morality. The moral system that helps human beings not to do this is the value of human life. I mean, when the euthanasia program came into Germany and they started to exterminate people who had physically and mentally disabled, they were not able to keep going because the ideological tenet that was still part of the Christian tradition was that life is sacred. All life is sacred. And that still lodged in the people. And also there were Germans that were doing it to other Germans. So there was a couple of different reasons. But the main one being was that they did not accept that massacring these people could be a good thing. So in order for this to work with the Jews, you had to dehumanize them. You had to turn them into something that was not human. But because even though the people who were disabled, and even though the Goebbels, who was a genius, did his very best to inoculate the ordinary people and with propaganda to convince them that because they had this new dogma or this new tenet, ideological tenet of the life unworthy of life, and that these had a life unworthy of life. And if you could get that across, then it became a logical piece. It became logical to kill them. But it didn't work because the life unworthy of life didn't stick. But what did stick was the Jews are not human. They're subhuman. So they don't deserve or warrant. They're a virus. And even if you think about the language, like in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis were, for the whole year beforehand, and it's ironic that it was the radio that got this, because the same thing happened in Germany, the use of the radio, to constantly talking about the Tutsis as cockroaches. So that's straight out of Goebbels' playbook. The kulaks in Russia the same. It's okay to starve them because they're kulaks. There's a term used, a pejorative term to describe them. So once you other the people, you create a schism in the human consciousness where these no longer warrant the care. They don't warrant the empathy, and they don't warrant the love, and they don't warrant the commitment because they're not us. So that's one piece of an ideological strand. But there are other pieces to that, which is, and this is where the zealots come in, and you need a certain cohort of zealots, So, Hitler in Mein Kampf called this the difference between a member and a follower. He had really no respect for the German people. He thought they were all sheep. His view was we need a certain number of members. And once we have the members, the followers will follow. This is the connection sometimes into Nietzsche as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking of him, yeah.
Because Nietzsche actually would have been horrified about what was happening in Germany. There's no doubt there was a terrible, terrible misrepresentation by his sister of Nietzsche's understanding of this. But so the ideological zealots, they gain hold of power. They get the propaganda. They know if they have a certain number of passionate zealots who are willing to kill, willing to do this job. Once they harness the banal to run the system, you don't need that many. You don't need that many. Maybe 5%. I haven't done any percentage. But that's all you need. And then, of course, within the camps, for example, here's the thing with the camps. The Germans were just so clever because they only had a certain number of zealots. So what they needed to do in the camps is they needed to get the criminals, the thugs, the people who everybody thinks are evildoers that I'm talking about today, the bad-minded, vengeful, horrible human beings. They were prized in the camps because they knew these criminals don't give a damn about murdering other people, so they were elevated to be the capos. They were given the jobs because they were cruel and they were corrupt. So we didn't need a zealot at that point because those people didn't have any ideological commitment to Nazism. They had an absolute commitment to their own survival, and they had a huge willingness to be amoral and to murder anybody that got in their way. So they were perfect. So those tools were used. The worst elements of human nature could be selected by the Germans to run the camps. So you didn't need an awful lot of zealots. But for all of that system to work, you needed a huge number of banal people who were willing to go along with it because they didn't have to face the consequences. So when we look at evil in terms of a society turning towards evildoing, we've got to look at what's the ideological system that's taking place. And Arendt helps us with this because she uses a really interesting, two really interesting things. One, she calls the recipes of ideology, which I thought was really recipes. I was thinking about making a cake. You want a currant cake, or you want a sponge cake, or you want what?
Christmas Nazi cake. Yeah.
So if you want a cake that will make for the pure Aryan race, that cake is going to require ideological pieces. That means you have to get rid of anybody that doesn't fit. And this was Himmler was a bit of a mystic, and there was stupid stuff going all around the world trying to find this pure Aryan bullshit.
Yeah.
But they bought into it, and Hitler bought into it, and this is what they were selling. And they sold this to the Germans, the German populace. But what that meant was getting to the final solution. We have got to rid all of the German body politic of this disease. So these human beings were no longer seen as human. The zealots were totally committed to that. They were also totally committed to the Third Reich, the great 1,000-year Reich. Stalin had the same thing, the great international communist regime, which would bring peace on earth. I mean, Karl Popper talks about this. He said, history tells us that the people who are really committed to heaven on earth always bring hell.
Yeah.
So the ideological strand has two. There's a recipe in the ideology, which is what's it made up of? What are the fundamental tenets of it? What is it saying? And the second thing is, does it have what Arendt calls a murderous alphabet? And the murderous alphabet is another really interesting concept because it's the idea of logic, that if you take one piece, will that lead to the next piece? And will that lead to like A, B, C, D? The logic and what she calls the iron grip of logic takes the place inside your head, which is, you say, right, you take something like the pure race. We have to get rid of all these people. What do we do with them? Right, okay. Well, like Himmler said, this is terribly messy. It's very cruel. We don't want to be cruel. We're not savages. The other people said, well, we're good people. We're good, decent. Because the thing in the speech opposed him, he said, we have seen tens of corpses, hundreds of corpses piled up over each other. And we've known this. And yet in all of this, we have remained decent. So how do you remain decent and exterminate millions of people? Well, you try to find the most humane way of doing it.
So yeah, the murderous alphabet I found a really good concept to hold because it's almost logic works fine, but it depends what the premise is you
That's
begin with.
exactly it. And
So
the ideological
as you mentioned
premise.
there, yeah. So as you mentioned there, the premise was, oh, we're Aryan, Aryans are great.
Yeah.
So then logic will work fine off that.
Yeah.
But what does it result in? I mean, the logic isn't faulty; it's that initial premise.
Exactly.
Do you mind if I read that Himmler speech,
Sure,
Mike?
no
I think
problem.
it'll
Yeah.
give the
Yeah. Yeah.
listeners
Okay.
a better idea of what we're talking
Okay.
about. Unless you want to
Sure.
read it. Do you want to read it?
I don't have it to hand. You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Himmler infamously explains, the wealth they possessed we took from them. I gave a strict order, which has been carried out by SS Obergruppe Pol, that this wealth will of course be turned over to the Reich in its entirety. We have taken none of it for ourselves. Individuals who have erred will be punished in accordance with the order given by me at the start, threatening that anyone who takes as much as a single mark of this money is a dead man. A number of SS men, they are not very many, committed this offence, and they shall die. There will be no mercy. We had the moral right, we had the duty towards our people to destroy this people that wanted to destroy us. But we do not have the right to enrich ourselves by so much as a fur, as a watch, by one mark, or even a cigarette, or anything else. All in all, however, we can say that we have carried out this most difficult task in the spirit of love for our people, and we have suffered no harm to our inner being, our soul, or our character. It's frightening.
Yeah.
I think that should be plastered all over Israel right now too.
Uh-huh.
But I think it is frightening how much how he's trying to build up how good they are for doing this
Mm-hmm.
awful thing.
Yeah.
And it's that murderous alphabet that lets that logic take place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
And then you see the other piece of the murderous alphabet is that once you've started, the other piece then is because when I was thinking about that, I was still thinking about Christopher Browning's story about the Hamburg police, that he shows how the first time they did it, they were so upset and sick and comforted each other and whatever. And then they did it again, and then they made a few changes. They didn't have to talk to them. They didn't have to bring them out individually to shoot them in the head, because they had to show them how to shoot the children. They allowed the mothers and children to be held together because they were trying to separate the children from the mothers before murdering them. And that was causing, this is something that the Hamburg police, they were not able to get them to do. They were not able to get them to take the babies off the mothers. So they said, no, they'll let you kill the mothers and children together. So they sort of eased it a bit. And gradually, but by about 2 weeks later, they were killing people without any, compunction. They just thought it was really tough work, and they were really unlucky that they were sent from Hamburg. They could have been doing their traffic warden work in Hamburg and not have to be doing any of this shit, basically. That's what, and they comforted each other. So
at that stage, did something have to have left them? Did some form of humanity
this
have
is
to have
called
left them?
desensitization. There's two things that happen. In my understanding of this is desensitization, which is once you start doing something horrible, it gets easier to do. If you feel that you have to do it, it gets easier. And that's why murderers can become quite ruthless, why terrorists can become quite cold-hearted about it, because they see this now as their duty. This is the task. It's horrible, and they comfort each other in it, and that's it. But the other piece I think is very interesting, and that's the notion of sacrifice. And
Yes,
Yuval
this is a big
Harari,
one.
yeah, Harari's really interesting in that in Homo Deus. He tells the story about Don Quixote, that the old elderly gentleman who's actually, sort of fighting imaginary monsters, and to gain the hand of the beautiful maid or whatever that is, And it's a fantasy, and he's dreaming about it. But Harari makes this point. He said, imagine if he actually did kill somebody in this path. He would have to believe that he did it that there was real meaning in it. There had to be meaning in it. The more you sacrifice for something, the more you have to find meaning in it. So this is part of why the ideology then can absolutely capture you, because you have sacrificed so much for it. And this is why when we talk about this, and if I'm having a conversation with someone who is quite zealous in their commitment to an ideological position, I know that it's not good for me to push them, because they're going to harden their position, because it's cost too much. In economics, this is called sunk cost, and the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost is when your accountant says you're never getting that money back, and the sunk cost fallacy is I'll put more in and maybe I'll get it back. So the sunk cost fallacy, morally and emotionally, is if you have sacrificed so much for an ideology, you better be damn sure that this ideology is true. And that is so difficult. It is so difficult to think. Now, this is what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder as well, something that people don't talk about when they talk about post-traumatic stress. We think about post-traumatic stress in relation to soldiers. We'll say it became the go-to phrase in psychology after Vietnam, because then this was where it was really recognized as being this condition. It had several symptoms and wherever it was. Generally, when it's spoken about, it's it's the person's exposure to terrible fear and danger, constant exposure to fear and danger. But there is another form of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that is coming to terms with what you did, that you became a murderer. And that one is one that kills a lot of people. They kill themselves. And Arendt says this about thoughtlessness and the people who killed themselves before they were taken, or when they were supposed to do this, or fought back, or hid the Jews. And she said, because somewhere, and this is the thought, this is like the Socratic 2-in-1. She goes back to Socrates, and Socrates has a dialogue with Hippias, and Hippias is a bit stupid, and Socrates is kind of jealous. He says, when you go home, you just put the legs up, and if he had Netflix, he'd be watching Netflix. He wouldn't give a damn. He wouldn't be thinking. He says, when I go home, I have to face myself, and I have to interrogate myself, because of that 2-in-1. And what Arendt says is the people who could not live with themselves, because they could not live themselves if they were a murderer. They could not live with a murderer who were themselves. So this is a very deep insight in terms of the power of thinking as a means of helping people to not deny the responsibility of what they're doing. So we're talking in extremes here. But the banal evildoer, the one who's sending the deportation notice, when that frame of understanding this thing about evil, and I would love, something I was talking to someone in the philosophy, I would love to have a module on evil for transition year students. Can you imagine? But not a hope in the world of that ever happening.
No.
No.
That's because the privative ideas are so
this
dominant,
would be way too disturbing. It would be and the thing that's awful about this is it flies in the face of all the research as well. I was looking at research recently. Many criminals they've got self-esteem problem, but what people don't realize is their self-esteem is too high.
Oh, please tell me more about this.
Yeah. Unearned high self-esteem is one of the features, particularly of gangbangers and that. The sense of entitlement, the rage, the violence.
Yeah.
They have an overvalued view of what they're able to do and not do, and an overestimate of how much they're entitled to. and a rage when don't get what they're entitled to, and they take it. So that's part of their criminality.
Okay.
So,
Is it?
so this whole Rousseauian utopianism it's there. I see it everywhere, and
Yeah.
I think we really need to take stock on that. I think we really need to, as a society and in education, we need to stop fooling ourselves.
But is it like there is positive benefits to this kind of privative ideas, and there is a lot of work that society has done and continues to do to kind of improve the environments to allow good to flourish. And I definitely agree a lot with that. And there's definitely an element of things that happen to people when they're young and they end up growing up and doing bad things.
Yeah.
There's
Yes,
definitely
but
an
again,
element
it's
of that.
very
So
interesting. It's very interesting. Most people who have been abused as children do not abuse other people. See, this is what we have to be really careful about the language here. You're absolutely right. Progress, as I said, we progress in two parallel lines. We progress for the good, and of course, ending poverty, all of that. I mean, I'm really positive about all of this, and really have huge, even like faith maybe in the human condition, in the human possibility, the human spirit, because I've spent my bloody lifetime harnessing that and whatever.
yeah,
But denying the notion of human evil as a real thing that needs to be identified and understood is very dangerous, because it
it's an
allows people,
ideology in itself.
that's exactly right.
Mm.
Because it's a bit like C.S. Lewis, the Christian apologist. He wrote the Screwtape Letters, where the older devil is writing to the younger devil. And one of the bits of advice that he gives him, he says, one of the most important things that you need to realize is the best thing to make sure of is make sure nobody believes you exist.
Yes.
So I would say, when you look at the thing about evil, to bring evil back into the conversation about the human condition, is not to denigrate the goodness at all, because I'm a dualist. I absolutely think, but we're not going to improve our. I don't think we're going to improve the human condition by denying that evil is a very real thing. And I think part of what's going on in our world, because we're looking at the world today, and the civilized, what we call the civilized world. It's like Mahatma Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said he thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, it'd be great when it happens. Yeah, brilliant answer.
I know that's a bit cynical on my part, because actually I have very strong positive views about Western civilization. I really do. I think that there's so many good things, so much. You get up in the morning and you're thankful for so much of what's there. I don't think we have to deny the existence of evil to really enjoy and the blessings of all that we have. I mean, even this conversation today is a miracle. It's an
It
absolute
is, yeah.
miracle. If you were to go back any time and say, well, I'm going to have a 2-hour conversation about history and human evil and psychology with Dahi, and we're going to talk to each other. He's going to be a couple of miles away. I'm here. We'll have that conversation, and then he's going to send it up into the sky, and the sky gods are going to send it down to everybody on a little box that they can look at. Wow.
Yeah.
Not even
No,
the Roman gods could do all that we're doing.
no. Indistinguishable from magic, I think, is what
Absolutely.
Harari calls it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it is. And is there in the privative view, which, as you say, is prominent, and I see is prominent too, it's we'll just get rid of evil, then everything will be good, and we'll all be good, and we can all go about our day, and everything will always be good. But in the dualist view, which is the position you take, it's like there's always going to be this battle. There's always going to be this this fight. We're always going to have to be wary of the rise of this force of evil. It's always awaiting to burst into the world, I think was one of the quotes you used.
Yes, there's I'll read that to you, because I think it's actually
Yeah,
very useful. It's from Roy Boymaster. He said, when evil increases, it does not necessarily mean that the causes of evil have become more powerful or important. Rather, it may mean that the inner controls have become weaker. Or to put it another way, you do not have to give people reasons to be violent, because they already have plenty of reasons. All you have to do is take away their reasons to restrain themselves. Even a small weakening of self-control might be enough to produce a rise in violence, Evil is always ready and waiting to burst into the world. So there's one of the things when we look at our ideological position, everybody has an ideology. Everybody lives in an ideological frame. There's no doubt about that. And this is where the self-reflection comes in. Does my ideology open up an avenue for evil to come into my world? Am I justifying something? And the issue of ideology is a big, big subject, and I'm going to be doing a bit more work on that in time. But yeah, so that awareness, self-reflection, this is a Socratic thing, the examined life. He talks about the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that's a bit harsh, actually, but the unexamined life is great in a society where the power structures are grounded in a moral frame that keeps the sacredness of the human being as its center. That was something I saw there. You were questioning, and it just struck me. You were saying at the end of our interview, you would ask me a question if I had to say something about human, and maybe that's the one, because I've never used that sentence quite in those words,
Okay,
that actually, that human life, the unexamined life, is okay if you live in a world or in a society where the power structures are grounded in a moral frame that elevates the human life as being sacred.
Because we're unavoidably in an ideology.
Yeah. And then when you say human life as being sacred, then you don't have the room to other the other. You don't have the room to take some humans as less worthy of that value than others.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. That's why human rights are so important, and that's why the erosion of human rights at the moment is so dangerous.
Absolutely.
And why
it's very
even
interesting.
the best people, the best people who worry about, I often hear them, and they criticize things that go on in the rest of the world, because you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this. And then it comes to immigrants coming here, and suddenly they're okay with them being less human. Suddenly they're okay with their human rights being not that important, because it's suddenly about to cost them something. But I think that it's key what you said there, that humans have rights by way of them being human. That's it. There doesn't need to be any other qualifications.
And you know what's interesting? Arendt had a fairly skeptical view of that, because what she said was, okay, lovely idea, but who allocates those rights? In the statelessness, and this is what she was thinking about, statelessness. When you're stateless, there's no protective umbrella to give you those rights. And the Nazis understood this as well. This is why the Nazis had rules about how it treated its citizens. So the first thing they needed to do when they expelled the Jews into France, when they sent them into France, they renounced their citizenship. So the German Jews no longer had citizenship. Now, once they had no citizenship, in Estonia, the people in Estonia, when the Nazis went into Estonia, they had already surrendered Estonia to Stalin in the Ribbentrop Act, whatever that treaty. So Estonia had lost its identity as a society under Stalin. So when Stalin left and the Nazis arrived, there was no state in place. 95% of Estonian Jews were murdered. In Denmark did not relinquish the rights of the Danish Jews. And so the Jews who were in Denmark, something like 90% of them survived. Now, the ones that didn't survive were the Jews from other countries who came into Denmark. They were not Danish citizens. So Arendt is really clear about this. She says, this is a lovely idea that by virtue of being human, you have rights. But she says, where did you get them from, and who looks after them? And that's why statelessness is really dangerous. And any system that starts to denude or discount your right to be somewhere, you see that sometimes in any of the migrant situations now, if you can take away the person's rights under the law of the state, then it's fair game.
They're not a juridical person.
That's right. She called that out. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, I think we'll start heading towards a close here, Mike.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe one or two final questions.
Sure.
What are the resources? What are the resources necessary to resist authority? And are we cultivating or eroding them today? Authority in the sense of that obedience and role immersion.
Well, authority, you see, I suppose my concern or my worry today is in relation to our society operating. It's less clear where the authority is coming from. I would see that the worry, if I was to think about this, it's not the brute authority. It's the soft authoritarianism. Herbert Marcuse talks about this. The gradual programming of the human being, and this is a Huxleyan view as well. The most important thing for the brave new world that Huxley would say is you have to get control of people, but they have to like being controlled. So
Yeah.
it's easier to fight against the jackboots kicking in your door than the subtle rewards that go into your mind, convincing you that something about the way this is going on is actually good. So becoming alert to the forces that, first of all, I would say resistance to authority. You can have passive resistance. I do know that passive resistance is very powerful. I mean, the guards are a really good case in point. I have to say now, I admired their cunning on this when they got the blue flu. It's against the law, to strike as a guard, but you're not against the law to actually get sick.
Okay.
So I'm thinking, okay, that's passive resistance. That's finding a loophole. Being late.
Yeah.
The Italians were brilliant at this. The Italians were never very fond of Hitler, and particularly the exportation of the Jewish people to the death camps. So they constantly messed with it by taking the German bureaucracy, which of course was very highly developed, and turning it against them, because they knew the Germans would not move unless they got the stamp of approval from whatever department. So the letter would come in asking for the deportation of whatever train of Jews, and your man would write back, yeah, I said, but the fella that was supposed to do that, he's on holidays, so would you send, or they'd send it back to the wrong address. So they said, we've already replied to this, but it went, and then they'd reply and saying, but that wasn't the right office, you sent it to the wrong office. So the Nazi has to go down to the wrong office, find a letter that never existed anyway, and come back, and then the other fella's on holidays. And all the time that this was happening, the Jews were escaping out of Italy, into South America, wherever they were, to get away, basically. So the bureaucracy, so the banal evildoer, potential banal evildoer, can still create their own little, moment. We're all kind of cowardly. Most people are not brave enough to stand up to the jackboots and get the shit bet out of them and kick to death inside in the Lubyanka or in the whatever. We're frightened. We're fearful. We want to save ourselves. So you have to think about, how do you resist?
Where can we throw a spanner in the works?
Yeah, even the smallest thing.
Of the evil ideology. Yeah.
The really important piece of that is that's about holding some of your moral compass still. You're still holding on. There aren't very many heroes. There aren't very many. I mean, I read about the heroes. And interesting research came across recently about the people who hid the Jews in Berlin. That when they did the study, they went, and they had two characteristics. One is the less educated, and two, the more religious.
Wow.
Education.
So they had perhaps an overriding ideology then that was.
That's exactly it. They had an ideological tenet that said this is wrong.
Yeah.
And again, as Arendt said, they did not want to live with themselves as being murdered. They saw it. They took risks. How many of us would? I mean, I think most people do this thought experiment, and I don't see it having much value, to be truly honest. Would I have hidden a Jew in my attic or whatever? Nobody really knows when it comes down to it.
Context.
Yeah, exactly. So, but in terms of, I think and this goes back to the Arendtian thing about thinking. Become aware of, is there a murderous alphabet in your ideological position? Is there a window open there that says to murder somebody for the soul of your country? Is that okay?
Yeah. Don't just let the elephant trot on through the world. Engage the
Absolutely.
rider.
Yeah.
Engage the rider.
Engage the rider and get to know the elephant. Look for this,
Exactly.
and then and Carl Jung's understanding the shadow. This is why the dualist view of evil for me is really, really important. And I know that, I think that within the Catholic frame, right through the generations, they spent far too much talking about the shadow, about the guilt, about the shame, about the badness. They really did that to the point where people felt horrible about themselves. They felt horrible. But they were very selective about the things that they thought were part of the shadow, like sex in your body and all the rest of that. Things that were not at all harmful. So, but you look and you say, is it okay to destroy somebody's livelihood because I don't agree with them? You know, there's different ways of killing people. The juridical person, the moral person. So we have to, and that's the piece where we look at our own corner of the world, that's the Solzhenitsyn's argument. It's the human heart. And we all have that capacity. And to what extent are we engaging? To what extent have we bought into a view? Do we just dig our hole? Do we just look at confirmation bias? Going back to the thing about authoritarianism, how do we fight it? It's the soft authoritarianism we have to be really careful about.
Yes. Okay. Much of modern psychology rests on the privative notion. And you discuss a kind of cult of self-worship, self-love that emerges from this kind of therapeutic culture. What dangers do you see in the glorification of the self without confronting the darker capacities?
Okay. I think one of the things, again, about being time-bound, that in the 70s and 80s, there was a rigidity and there was a very negative, it had probably come from the Freudian view, quite a negative view of human beings. Punitive child-rearing practices were punitive. Praise and support were limited. And the idea was, coming from the Old Testament thinking, spare the rod, spoil the child. This created generations of people who were deeply hurt and did not have the opportunity to really grow a lot of respect for themselves, a lot of value and good self-care. It was not a highly valued ideological piece. And this is where we'll say the birth of modern therapeutic psychology developed. It became, and in all aspects of it, they realized this is a real problem, and there's such lovely things happen when we change that. So the ideological shift was we need to move from repression, punishment, criticism, and we need to move towards affirmation, validation, praise. And then the pendulum swung the whole way across. During that time also, there was very little understanding of narcissism. Narcissism is a very serious problem in the world because it was there when people didn't understand it. They didn't understand what happens, that certain people are narcissistic in the sense that that's a long conversation. So I won't have much time to sort of go through it. But narcissism is the cult when human beings grow and have a distorted relationship with reality, whereby their fundamental orientation in life is narcissistic, is self-indulgent, is self-absorption. So in a society where the child-rearing practices were so punitive and so destructive, it crushed people's spirits. It left them feeling insecure and frightened who they were, unable to stand up for themselves, and replaced it with the possibility of growing into a better self, which is what therapy was all about, psychotherapy and all that. The problem became that it became in and of itself almost like an ideological piece. It comes from Abraham Maslow's idea of self-actualization. Self-actualization is the notion that your main purpose and meaning in life is to actualize yourself. It's a really, really interesting concept. Highly individualistic, tends to not be grounded in community and in society. It tends to become, So you become, like I'm responsible for my own orgasm kind of thing, and so there's something really valuable in this notion. Maslow's idea that the top of the human development is a self-actualized person. But what he doesn't talk about is who is the person you're going to actualize. If we think about the template of all different bits and pieces that go to make us up. Now, the postmodernists would disagree with me on this because their notion is there's no such thing, there's no essence in the human being and all the rest of that. Let's just call it potentially Carl Rogers' idea of the actualizing your potential. Becoming a self-actualized person is actualizing your potential. But if we take the dualist understanding of evil, I have the potential for evil. Do I actualize that? So can I be a self-actualized person who is absolute narcissistic con artist who will steal, rob, and take whatever I want and punish and abuse anybody that gets in my way? Of course. That's a self-actualized narcissist. So if we take modern psychotherapy, if we take a psychotherapy view that the cultivation of the self in and of itself with no value banisters, you are going to create monstrous levels of narcissism and self-absorption and self-entitlement. You're not going to increase happiness because if you are self-indulgent, if that's all you're about, you lose the capacity for love and intimacy. You love the ability for self-sacrifice, and you lose the ability for delaying gratification and discipline. These are hugely important elements of a healthy person. So while I see an enormous value in the therapeutic world, a lot of therapy doesn't address this issue. And it's the fear, and it's grounded in the fear that therapists must never make value judgments about their clients. They're just codding themselves. That's a fantasy. So what do I mean about, so that therapeutic model, which was absolutely so important in the repair of wounded children growing up in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, people who were victimized, then it became a kind of a dogma that this is what we have to do for everybody. So you end up in a situation where you actually indulge. Two things are happening. One, the ground for happiness shifts into indulging all your feelings. And this is happening in parenthood, in education. And the idea that suffering in the sense of pain is not essential to learning, which it is, and that the most important thing is you have to avoid any pain. There are people who suffer from a physical disease whereby they can't feel pain. They all die young. Pain is really important because it helps us to understand our relationship with the world. And psychological pain is really important because it helps us to recalibrate our relationship with the world. So the toddler stage of narcissism, a very useful picture, that is the picture of the toddler in the supermarket aisle, where you're standing there and you're looking at this child screaming and crying and banging their head on the floor because there's a chocolate bar they're not allowed to have. And we kind of smile at that because we know they're going through this. And anybody who has children themselves will know this because they'll have seen it actually happen. It's an incredibly important piece of personal development. But it's also, when you go into the world of the child, this is what I would call an existential crisis. If that child has been loved in a reasonable way, they will have grown in the early part of their consciousness to believe that they are the center of the world. That actually is really important for their development. It's an omnipotence that they have, which is that when they cry, mother comes. If they're hungry, mother or their caregiver comes and they're fed. They get the breast, they get cuddled, so there's a profound wiring of a sense of power. It's incredible the power they feel. They are the center of the universe, and they have to be in order to survive. And that's why they cry, they get fed. And they build, and Erik Erikson talks about this first huge chapter of life is between trust and distrust. Do you trust the world to meet your needs? So it's incredibly important. But you are developing, this is what Freud would call the narcissistic stage of human development. You are a narcissist to the last degree or last cell of your body. You believe the world was created for you. And then you're in the supermarket and you want the bar of chocolate and you're not going to get it. And if your parent is healthy and well, they will insist that you don't get it. Now you have to recalibrate your connection to the world and you will rage against that. And in that rage, you rebuild your relationship with reality and you begin to realize you're not the center of the world, but you're still okay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And that's
That line,
and that's it. And if you don't get that over a long period of time, because that happens from the age of about 2 on, the terrible 2s, but gradually you're recalibrating all the time. You're learning the social rules. You're learning not everything is yours. You learn how to play. You learn how to cooperate. You become part of a community. You learn how to love, and gradually you learn how to share yourself and how to give and receive. But if that part of you is broken and you stay in that state, you will never get out of the place where you feel that you are the center of the universe and you're entitled to anything you want and you take whatever you want. And people who are like that sometimes get into power.
And have a lot of...
And we won't say any more about
shall
that.
we say an orange aura? Let's just leave. They have been tangled. They have been tangled.
Well, when you look at Lenin, I look at the different leaders that led to.
You keep talking about the dead ones. I keep talking about the live ones.
I know, and I do so purposefully and intentionally. Yes.
I know.
Okay.
Very good. Okay, where can people find more of your stuff, Mike? And you're very interesting. It's a very interesting topic.
It's a basic website. All my books are available online. The early ones are all about child development, parental alcoholism, children of alcoholic families, trauma, the long-term effects of that. Then there's healing the hurts of childhood, which are children who have been abused or who've suffered. Then there's ones on addiction and codependency, and then the more recent ones. The one we're talking today is the main story. This is The Path to Mass Evil, which is it's available online. It's expensive. Routledge is the publisher, so there's nothing I can do about that. The other one is Misled: How Ideology Captures Your Mind. That's available online to download as an ebook, as is the one on authenticity. michaelhardiman.net.
Excellent. Have you any final words of advice for people who want to actively avoid evil doing?
Yeah. Locate your vulnerability to where your vulnerability to evil will be. Some people, it's ideological. The more idealistic, the more educated of us. Ideological, educated, smart people who really want to do something really nice in the world, really good in the world. They join cults in university.
Okay.
Yeah. Later on in life, they'll embrace political agendas or whatever, but they have to be really careful that there is not embedded in their ideology a murderous alphabet, a place whereby you will allow cruelty to emerge, to harm, or to do away with the notion of the sacredness of the human. That's one. So that would be the piece. We all are susceptible to evil doing. The biggest mistake we can make is to think that the evil doing we're not susceptible to is over there, because I'm highly unlikely to be someone who'll go out tomorrow and rob a bank. I'm much more likely to be someone who's ideologically committed to something that would mean that. Narcissism is a second. But so knowing the shadow, this is the Carl Jung piece. So we address the possibilities for evil within ourselves. That's our first route. This does not mean that you don't be politically active. Look at the banality of evil doing. Look at the everyday things that we do and think, does this add another grain of sand to the beach of evil, or does it take one away? It doesn't have to, and the thing about that is it does not have to be a morose piece. It doesn't have to be, It doesn't have to be morose, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't. You don't have to be showered with guilt. Guilt is important. The people who don't feel guilty, like the ones who don't feel pain, the ones who don't feel guilty, are psychopaths. We have to feel. It's good to feel guilty every now and again. But the church in Ireland made us feel guilty about just being alive, so we got rid of guilt. But that's not the solution.
Yeah. As you said, the pendulum swung too far the other way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, the question I ask all my guests at the end: if we were writing a new story about what it is to be human, and you could add one sentence, what would that sentence be?
What it is to be human. We're the only creature that can have a relationship with themselves. And that relationship will
Brilliant.
stay with you for the rest of your life. And you need to look at it.
Brilliant. Okay, that's a very good one. Okay, Mike, thank you very much. I'm just going to finish, not with a direct quote, but it's something paraphrased from Robert Nozick from The Examined Life. And then we'll say goodbye. Please don't hang up, Mike, you, as I hang up the other people. But and here it is. There is a difference between explaining evil and accepting it. Explanation must not become endorsement. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe, please. It helps. Bye-bye now. 3, 4.